What would you do if the very person meant to protect your neighborhood was the one stealing from it, and the only way to expose her was with a trap no one could forget? Where are my packages going? That was the question running through Preston Mallory's head as he stood on the porch of his new townhouse, staring at the empty spot where a box should have been. It wasn't just a late delivery. The tracking number said delivered. He'd even gotten the picture. There it was, a brown cardboard box sitting neatly against the front door at 3:17 p.m. Yet now, at 5:42, it was gone. This wasn't the first time either. In the 3 short weeks since Preston had moved into the quiet suburban cul-de-sac on the edge of Plano, Texas, 3 packages had vanished the same way. He could almost accept it happening once, maybe twice. But 3 times? That was no coincidence. That was a problem. At first, he figured it was just random porch pirates. He'd read enough neighborhood apps and local Facebook rants to know it happened all the time. Still, something about it didn't sit right with him. His new neighborhood had gated access, cameras at both entrances, and retirees who treated the place like a watchtower. Strangers didn't just wander in and out unnoticed. So how could someone waltz up to his door in broad daylight and take a box without anyone saying a word? Preston bent down and ran his hand along the welcome mat, as if the package might magically reappear if he checked close enough. He shook his head. Whoever was doing this wasn't sloppy. They were bold. That evening, he walked across the street to chat with Owen Driscoll, a man in his 60s who always seemed to be watering his lawn or sweeping his driveway. Preston figured if anyone had seen something, it'd be Owen. "Hey, Owen, quick question for you," Preston said, hands in his pockets. "You notice anybody hanging around here earlier today?" UPS dropped off a box for me, but it's gone now. Owen leaned on his rake, giving Preston a look like he already knew where this was going. "You're not the first one. Couple of folks down the block mentioned the same thing. Word is," he lowered his voice, even though no one else was around. "Word is, Geraldine's been seen walking off with boxes." Preston frowned. "Geraldine? The HOA president?" Owen replied, pointing to the 2-story unit with the stone facade and perfectly manicured rose bushes. "Lives right there. She's, how do I put this, particular. Keeps tabs on everyone. Says it's for the good of the community. But a few people think she helps herself to packages now and then." Preston let out a short laugh, more out of disbelief than amusement. "You're telling me the HOA president is stealing deliveries?" "Wouldn't shock me," Owen said, shrugging. "She's got her hand in everything else." That night, Preston sat in his living room, scrolling through his phone, the TV on mute in the background. His gut told him Owen might be right. Earlier that week, he'd caught Geraldine standing in his yard, clipboard in hand, staring at the paint on his shutters. When he'd stepped outside to ask what she was doing, she gave him a lecture about color shades and HOA guidelines as if she owned the property herself. Preston wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but something about her eyes, sharp, assessing, always watching, made the possibility feel real. Could the same woman who fined a neighbor for leaving a trash bin out too long also be bold enough to steal boxes right off porches? He leaned back on the couch and muttered to himself, "If it is her, I'm going to find out." And from that moment on, he knew this wasn't just about missing packages anymore. It was about principle. He'd worked hard for the life he was building here, and he wasn't about to let someone, HOA president or not, decide what he could or couldn't have. But the thing about going up against someone like Geraldine Caffrey was simple. Once you challenged her authority, there was no going back. But before Preston could figure out how to prove it, he had to understand the kind of person Geraldine really was. Preston Mallory hadn't moved to Plano on a whim. The decision came after years of cramped apartments, unreliable landlords, and constant noise bleeding through paper-thin walls. He had spent his late 30s grinding at a tech job in Dallas, pulling long hours and saving every penny, determined to finally own something that felt permanent. When he found the townhouse, it seemed like the answer. A safe neighborhood, good schools nearby even though he didn't have kids, and a community that promised order. At first, everything felt like a breath of fresh air. The streets curved neatly, lined with trimmed hedges and uniform mailboxes. People waved as they passed, and for the first time in years, Preston felt like he belonged somewhere. He could park his car without fighting for space. He could take his evening jog without dodging traffic. He thought, this is what I've been working for. He moved in on a Saturday morning, greeted by a few neighbors who came by with casual welcomes. A middle-aged woman named Irene Callahan stopped to say hello, telling him she lived 2 units down and taught 2nd grade. Another, Victor Rowe, shook his hand firmly and joked that new homeowners had to supply barbecue for the whole block. Preston laughed, appreciating the warmth, but even during those first days, he noticed something different about the woman across the street. Geraldine Caffrey didn't say hello. Instead, she lingered on her porch with her arms folded, studying him as movers carried his furniture inside. When Preston waved, she gave a stiff nod and scribbled something on the clipboard she always seemed to carry. At the time, he brushed it off as nothing more than neighborly curiosity. Inside, Preston unpacked slowly, setting up the essentials: his couch, his desk, his kitchenware. On the second night, he ordered a set of pots and pans online, excited to finally cook proper meals in his new place. But when the delivery alert came the next day, the box was nowhere to be found. He figured the driver must have dropped it off at the wrong door. Mistakes happen. The second time, though, the pit formed in his stomach. This time it was a box of new running shoes. The tracking photo showed them on his porch, gone within hours. He called the shipping company, filed a claim, and hoped for the best. By the third time, the frustration had settled deep. Preston found himself walking the sidewalks at dusk, glancing at porches, searching for any clue. That was when he began to notice how much power Geraldine carried in the neighborhood. She wasn't just the president of the HOA. She was the HOA. Residents mentioned her name constantly, the way she dictated lawn heights, the way she sent emails about which holiday decorations were acceptable, the way she fined a retired couple for planting tomatoes instead of approved shrubs. She's not all bad, Irene Callahan told him one evening as they chatted in front of their driveways. She does keep things looking nice. But she can go too far. Preston tilted his head. Too far how? Irene hesitated, glancing toward Geraldine's house. Let's just say she doesn't think the rules apply to her the same way they do to everyone else. That vague answer stuck with him. The more Preston looked around, the more he saw signs of Geraldine's control. Her roses always bloomed perfectly, her siding always spotless, her driveway polished like it was on display. But beneath the perfection, there was something off. A few neighbors seemed nervous to even mention her name, as if saying the wrong thing might bring consequences. Still, Preston tried to stay positive. He decorated his living room with framed photos of hiking trips in Colorado, bought a grill for weekend cookouts, and invited a couple of co-workers over to see the new place. He wanted this chapter of his life to feel good. Yet every time he thought about the missing packages, that optimism dimmed. He couldn't shake the image of Geraldine standing with her clipboard, watching. He started paying attention to small details, the way she timed her walks around the block, the way she seemed to know exactly when delivery trucks came through, the way she sometimes parked her SUV halfway down the street instead of in her own driveway, as if trying to blend in. One afternoon, Preston spotted her bending over a neighbor's porch, fussing with a box of gardening supplies. She stood up quickly when she realized he was watching. She smiled thinly, waved her pen, and said, "Just making sure it wasn't left out in the open too long. We have to protect our community." Mr. Mallory. Preston forced a polite smile back, but inside, the suspicion grew heavier. Protect the community? Or protect herself? He didn't have proof yet. Just whispers, instincts, and a string of vanished boxes. But the more he learned about Geraldine, the clearer it became. She was not the kind of neighbor who would let things slide, and she was not someone who liked being challenged. But if Preston was right about her, he was already on her radar, and that meant things were only going to get more complicated. If you asked 10 people on Preston's block about Geraldine Caffrey, you'd likely get 10 different answers, but they'd all carry the same nervous undertone. To some, she was the woman who kept the neighborhood spotless, always reminding people of deadlines for pressure washing or repainting shutters. To others, she was a bully with a pen and clipboard, writing fines with a zeal that felt personal. Preston learned more about her over cups of coffee with neighbors and casual chats at the mailbox. Geraldine had lived in the community for over a decade, and in that time, she had carved out an image of authority. She was in her early 60s, with sharp features and a wardrobe full of pressed blouses and loafers. Everything about her screamed control, from the way she corrected people when they mispronounced her last name to how she dictated where holiday lights should be hung. One Saturday morning, Preston saw her in action. He was trimming his hedges when Geraldine walked briskly down the street, clipboard in hand, stopping at a townhouse 3 doors down. A young couple, Alex and Marissa Blanton, had just moved in with their toddler. Geraldine didn't knock politely. She rapped on the door 3 times, firm enough to echo. When Marissa answered, Geraldine wasted no time. "Your trash cans are still at the curb," she said, her tone clipped. "According to the HOA bylaws, they must be brought in by 8 a.m. sharp. This is your first warning." Marissa stammered. "Oh, sorry, I'll bring them in right now." "See that you do," Geraldine replied, jotting something down on her clipboard before striding off. Preston felt his jaw tighten. The whole scene lasted less than a minute, but it told him everything he needed to know. Geraldine enjoyed the power. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was asserting dominance. Later that day, Preston ran into Alex in the parking lot. Alex shook his head. "She's unbelievable, man. We've been here a week, and already she's threatening us with fines. I told Marissa not to worry, but it's stressful, you know?" Preston nodded. "She's intense. Has she ever done anything worse than that?" Alex lowered his voice. "Between you and me, some folks say she takes things, packages mostly, but nobody wants to push it because she controls the fines. You cross her, and suddenly you're paying for things you didn't even know were violations." The rumor was spreading, and Preston could feel the pieces sliding into place. Still, he didn't want to jump to conclusions without seeing something himself. That chance came sooner than expected. One evening, he was out on his porch when the FedEx truck pulled up. The driver placed a medium-sized box at his door. Preston stayed put, sipping his coffee, pretending to scroll on his phone. 15 minutes later, Geraldine strolled past, clipboard tucked under her arm. She didn't look at him directly, but she slowed down just enough to glance at the package. "Evening, mister." "Mallory," she said. "Evening," Preston replied, forcing a friendly tone. Her eyes flicked to the box again. "Be careful with deliveries. We've had issues with theft in this community. Best not to leave things unattended." With that, she walked away, her loafers clicking against the pavement. Preston's grip tightened on his coffee cup. There was no theft problem, except the one possibly standing in front of him. The next morning, he decided to test her indirectly. He spoke with Irene Callahan again, this time with a little more urgency. "Irene, can I ask you something straight up? Do you think Geraldine takes people's packages?" Irene hesitated, then sighed. "I can't prove anything, but I've lost a few. And once, I saw her carrying a box into her garage that I'm sure wasn't hers. When I asked, she said she was keeping it safe until the owner came to claim it. Funny thing is, I never got mine back." Preston exhaled slowly. "So, you think she's been doing this for a while?" "Let's just say she knows how to cover her tracks," Irene answered. By now, Preston's suspicions had hardened into conviction. He was dealing with more than a nosy HOA president. Geraldine had found a way to use her authority as a shield, making it hard for anyone to accuse her without fear of retaliation. But Preston wasn't wired to let things slide. He'd worked too hard for this life, too hard to finally own a place of his own, only to let someone like Geraldine treat him like a pawn in her little kingdom. He was done playing polite, but before he could confront her, he had to try the official route: complaints, reports, and a fair shot at justice. The more Preston thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. He wasn't the type to accuse without proof, but every conversation with neighbors, every glance at Geraldine's smug expression when she mentioned package theft, pushed him closer to certainty. He decided to start small. Document everything. That week, Preston set up a motion-activated camera above his front door. Nothing fancy, just a mid-range model he bought online, the kind you could set up with an app. When the package arrived, he felt a twinge of excitement. Finally, he'd have eyes on his porch 24/7. But on the second day, as if mocking his effort, another delivery vanished. Preston pulled up the footage immediately, heart pounding. He watched the playback, the UPS driver placing a box by the door at 11:06 a.m., then leaving. For the next hour, nothing. Just cars passing and a neighbor's cat darting across the walkway. By 12:17 p.m. the box was gone. No one on camera. Preston leaned back in his chair, muttering, "That's impossible." He rewound, watched again. Still nothing. Somehow whoever was taking the packages knew how to avoid being seen. Either that or they had a key to his porch camera's blind spots. That evening, he took his frustration to Irene Callahan. "Did your camera catch anything?" she asked, adjusting her tote bag on her shoulder as they stood by the row of mailboxes. "Nothing," Preston said. "It's like the thing just vanished." "I don't get it." Irene gave a wry smile. "Geraldine knows every inch of this neighborhood. If she's doing it, she probably knows where cameras don't point." Preston frowned. "So what? She's been stealing for years and nobody's stopped her." "People have tried," Irene said softly. "One guy down the street confronted her a few years back. Next thing he knew, he had 3 fines in 1 month. Paint, lawn length, and mailbox color. He ended up moving. Preston's stomach twisted. That was the power Geraldine held. Even suspicion came with a price. Still, he wanted something solid. So he expanded his plan. He asked Victor Rowe, the neighbor who joked about barbecue, if he'd seen anything. Victor scratched his beard and said, "Funny you mention it. Couple months ago I had a new set of golf clubs shipped. Never arrived. Tracking said, delivered. Few weeks later, I spotted Geraldine's grandson swinging a 9-iron in her backyard. Same brand, same bag. You tell me." Preston's eyebrows shot up. "Did you say anything?" Victor chuckled dryly. "Sure. I asked her about it at the HOA meeting. She looked me dead in the eye and said she'd bought them second-hand. What am I supposed to do? Call her a liar in front of 30 people? No thanks." The puzzle pieces were stacking higher. Every story pointed in the same direction. Geraldine wasn't just strict. She was entitled, and no one dared push back. That night, Preston sat at his kitchen table, staring at the glow of his laptop screen. He pulled up the HOA bylaws, scrolling line after line of rigid language about paint colors, landscaping, and fines. What struck him most was how much power the president held. Enforcement authority, discretion over penalties, and even the ability to approve or deny appeals. In other words, Geraldine was judge, jury, and executioner in this little cul-de-sac kingdom. He closed the laptop and rubbed his temples. "So if I call her out, she'll bury me in fines. And if I stay quiet, she keeps stealing." The next morning, fate gave him another clue. Preston was heading out for work when he saw a FedEx truck parked 2 doors down. The driver set a large package on the Blantons' porch. 10 minutes later, Geraldine emerged from her garage, clipboard in hand. She walked casually up the street, slowed as she neared the box, glanced around, then bent down. From where he stood, Preston couldn't see exactly what she did. But by the time she walked back toward her house, the box was gone. He clenched his fists, debating whether to shout across the street. Instead, he pulled out his phone and texted Marissa. "Hey, did you get a delivery just now?" Her reply came back 2 minutes later. "Nope, nothing yet." "Why?" Preston stared at the screen. His suspicion had crossed into certainty. That night, he sat on his porch with Irene, the two of them sipping tea as the summer air cooled. "I saw her today," Preston said flatly. Irene turned her head. "With a package?" "Yep, took it straight off the Blantons' porch. Walked away like it was hers." Irene blew out a slow breath. "Then you know what you're up against." "She won't admit it. And if you accuse her, she'll make your life miserable." Preston's jaw tightened. "Maybe. But I can't let her keep doing it. Somebody has to stop her." But going through the official channels was the only reasonable first step, and Preston was about to learn just how useless those channels could be. Preston believed in giving people the chance to do things the right way. Before he resorted to traps or public shaming, he wanted to see if the system worked, even if that system was the HOA Geraldine ruled like a fiefdom. So the next morning, he sat down at his dining table with his laptop and drafted a formal complaint. He included dates, tracking numbers, and a description of the missing packages. He kept his tone professional. No accusations, just a request for the HOA to investigate. When he hit send, a copy of the email went not only to Geraldine, but to the HOA's general account. He expected it might take a few days to get a response. Instead, an email pinged his inbox within an hour. "Mr. Mallory," it read, "we appreciate your concern regarding deliveries. Unfortunately, the HOA is not responsible for individual property security. It is the homeowner's duty to safeguard personal packages. We recommend installing cameras and being present for deliveries whenever possible. Regards, G. Caffrey, HOA President." Preston read it twice, then laughed bitterly. He already had cameras, and how was he supposed to be present for every delivery when he worked a full-time job? The reply wasn't an answer. It was a dismissal. That evening, he decided to speak to Geraldine in person. He caught her on her driveway as she was clipping dead blooms from her rose bushes, wearing gardening gloves and that same clipboard tucked under her arm. "Evening, Ms. Caffrey," he began carefully. She looked up, her expression polite but guarded. "Mr. Mallory, what can I do for you?" "I sent an email earlier today. About my packages." "Yes," she said briskly. "And as I explained, the HOA has no liability. Theft is a police matter." Preston held her gaze. "So you're saying if someone is stealing from multiple houses in this neighborhood, you don't see that as your concern?" Geraldine's lips tightened. "What I'm saying is that the HOA is not a security service. If you believe a crime has been committed, you are free to contact law enforcement. Meanwhile, I would remind you to ensure your shrubs remain within the height restrictions outlined in our bylaws." Preston's chest burned. "With respect, Ms. Caffrey, this isn't about my shrubs. People are losing property. I think you know that." Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but her voice remained even. "I would be careful about making insinuations without evidence, Mr. Mallory. False accusations against neighbors can themselves be considered a violation of our community standards." It was a warning cloaked in formality. Preston forced a smile, though his jaw ached. "I'm not making accusations. I'm asking for accountability. Surely that's in everyone's interest." Geraldine turned back to her roses. "Enjoy your evening." That was the end of the conversation. Preston stormed back inside, pacing his living room. She hadn't denied anything. She hadn't even acted surprised. Instead, she'd deflected and thrown in a threat. He knew then that going through official HOA channels was pointless. She controlled them. The next day, he called the non-emergency police line. An officer came by, took a report, and listened patiently as Preston explained the string of missing packages. The officer nodded, scribbling notes. "Problem is," the officer said finally, "without footage or a witness, we can't pin it on anyone. We'll add it to our records, but porch theft cases are hard to prosecute unless we catch someone in the act." Preston pressed. "Even if multiple neighbors say the same person is involved?" "Even then," the officer replied, "we need concrete proof. My advice? Set up a decoy package. Sometimes that works." Preston raised an eyebrow. "A decoy?" The officer shrugged. "Something you don't mind losing. Could even be empty. Thieves don't usually check before grabbing. Catch it on camera, then we've got something to go on." That idea stuck with him. He thanked the officer and closed the door, his mind racing. Later that week, at the monthly HOA meeting in the community center, Preston sat near the back as Geraldine ran through agenda items with her usual clipped authority. She lectured about landscaping violations, parking rules, and dues payments. Not once did she mention the rash of missing packages. When a resident timidly asked if security cameras could be added at the entrances, Geraldine dismissed it as unnecessary expenditure. Preston's patience wore thin. He raised his hand. "Miss Caffrey, shouldn't we at least address the theft issue? Several of us have lost deliveries." The room grew quiet. Geraldine's eyes found his. "As I've explained, theft is not within HOA jurisdiction. If you have personal concerns, I suggest you contact the appropriate authorities." A murmur rippled through the residents. Some looked at Preston with sympathy, others with discomfort, but no one spoke up. Geraldine moved briskly on to the next topic, shutting down the discussion as if it had never happened. Preston sat back, his fists clenched beneath the table. That was it. No more complaints, no more polite requests. She wasn't going to help because she was the problem. If he wanted justice, he'd have to make it himself. But before he could act, he needed a plan, and the officer's advice about a decoy package gave him exactly the idea he was looking for. Preston sat at his kitchen table late into the night, the glow from his laptop reflecting off half-empty coffee mugs and the unopened mail stacked by the salt shaker. The officer's words replayed in his head. Set up a decoy package. At first it sounded too simple, but the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the only way forward. Geraldine wasn't going to stop unless she got caught red-handed. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. An empty box wouldn't do. If she took it and tossed it, he'd lose his one shot at proof. No, he needed something that would hit harder, something she couldn't deny or brush aside with another one of her clipped, dismissive replies. That's when the idea struck. He'd read about a man in Ohio who left a glitter bomb in a decoy box for porch pirates. The footage had gone viral. Preston chuckled at the thought, but glitter felt too harmless. Geraldine had been humiliating people for years with fines and petty rules. If he wanted to send a message, it had to sting. His eyes drifted toward the backyard, where motion lights cast shadows across the grass. That's when he remembered. 2 weeks earlier, a skunk had sprayed near his garage. The stench had lingered for days, impossible to scrub out of the air. If he could somehow recreate that scenario inside a box, Geraldine wouldn't just be embarrassed. She'd be exposed in the most unforgettable way possible. The next morning, Preston drove to a small feed store on the edge of town. He explained he needed a live trap, the kind used for raccoons or stray cats. The clerk handed him a metal cage with a spring door. Preston loaded it into the back of his SUV, his heart racing with equal parts nerves and anticipation. That night, he set the trap near the woodpile in his yard, baiting it with leftover peanut butter sandwiches. He didn't have to wait long. By dawn, the faint rustling from the corner of the yard told him it worked. Inside the cage, black and white fur shifted restlessly. A skunk, agitated but unharmed. Preston crouched nearby, covering his nose with his sleeve. "Sorry, buddy. You've got a role to play." He carried the trap into his garage and carefully placed it inside a large cardboard box. He cut air holes along the sides and layered the bottom with newspaper so the animal wouldn't panic as much. The skunk shuffled, but the cage kept it secure. The lid closed snugly, and Preston taped it shut. On the outside, he slapped on a bright sticker. Fragile. Handle with care. The sight of that box sitting in his garage made his pulse quicken. It looked like any normal delivery, except for the ticking time bomb inside. That afternoon, Preston placed the package on his porch, angled perfectly within the view of his camera. He sat by the window, pretending to read a book, but keeping one eye fixed on the street. Every sound made his chest tighten. At 3 p.m, Geraldine emerged from her house, clipboard in hand, striding with her usual air of authority. She stopped halfway down the street, scanning like she always did, then her eyes locked on the box. Preston's breath caught. She glanced around, her movements casual but deliberate. No one else was outside. She walked up to Preston's porch, leaned down, and in one smooth motion scooped up the package. She cradled it against her hip as if she were doing a good deed, then walked briskly back toward her garage. Preston gripped the edge of the curtain. "Got you," he whispered. Inside her garage, the plan would spring to life. He couldn't see directly, but he didn't need to. Moments later, the muffled clang of a cage shifting was followed by a high-pitched shriek that cut through the quiet neighborhood. Then came the unmistakable odor, drifting into the air like an invisible storm cloud. Preston burst into laughter, the kind that came from weeks of bottled frustration finally breaking loose. Neighbors stepped out of their homes, wrinkling their noses, murmuring questions. Within minutes, Geraldine stumbled out of her garage, gagging, her blouse stained, her hands waving helplessly as if she could fan the smell away. Her clipboard dropped to the driveway. Forgotten. She spotted Preston watching from his porch. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she looked rattled. The trap had sprung, and the neighborhood was about to learn the truth. But what Preston didn't realize yet was that the fallout wouldn't just humiliate Geraldine, it would turn the entire community against her. The skunk's release into Geraldine's perfectly ordered world wasn't just an accident waiting to happen, it was a collision between control and chaos. For years she had kept the neighborhood under her thumb with clipped rules and cold warnings, but this time she was the one caught off guard. From his window, Preston only caught fragments. Geraldine dragging the box inside, the squeak of hinges as the garage door closed, and then silence. A stretched, uneasy silence that made him lean closer to the glass. He imagined her setting the package on a workbench, maybe slipping on her glasses, peeling the tape carefully, certain she was about to get away with yet another rescued delivery. And then it happened. First came the scrape of the cage, metal against cardboard. Then a sharp scream. Not the kind Geraldine used when scolding neighbors, but the raw, startled cry of someone blindsided. The next instant, the smell hit. It didn't just seep. It poured out, thick and sour, rolling across the cul-de-sac like an invisible wave. Preston pressed his hand against his mouth, laughing into his palm. From the sidewalk, he heard doors creak open. Irene Callahan stepped out, fanning the air immediately. "What in the world is that?" she coughed. 2 houses down, Victor Rowe leaned against his truck, grimacing. "Smells like somebody ticked off a skunk." By the time Geraldine stumbled out of her garage, the story was writing itself. Her blouse clung with wet stains, her hair disheveled, her face twisted in panic as she gasped for air. She waved her arms wildly, but the stench clung to her like glue. Her clipboard, the symbol of her authority, lay abandoned on the driveway. Neighbors clustered on their porches, whispering. A few even laughed quietly, though they covered it with coughs. Geraldine spun toward Preston's house, her eyes wide with fury and disbelief. "You!" she screamed, pointing an accusatory finger across the street. Preston stepped out onto his porch, arms folded. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even smile. "Everything okay over there, Ms. Caffrey?" Gasps rippled through the spectators. Geraldine froze, realizing how this looked. Her storming out of her garage, reeking of skunk, while everyone else stood clean and curious. For the first time, the power balance shifted. She was the spectacle. Inside, Preston's camera had captured everything. Her taking the box, carrying it away, and the fallout that followed. Proof at last. Geraldine tried to rally, straightening her posture even as her clothes dripped. "Someone put an animal in that box. This is harassment. This is criminal." Victor barked out a laugh. "Funny. I thought you said the HOA doesn't handle theft. So why were you opening a package that wasn't yours?" All eyes turned back to Geraldine. She floundered for words. I was protecting the neighborhood, making sure no one else—" But the excuses collapsed under the weight of the smell and the murmurs building around her. "Protecting us?" Irene said sharply. "Or protecting yourself?" The group's tone shifted. Years of bottled irritation were spilling out. People who'd swallowed fines, warnings, and lectures were finally seeing her vulnerable, and they weren't about to let it go. Preston held back, letting the scene unfold. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about the community finally seeing Geraldine for who she really was. He only spoke when the silence grew long enough for his voice to land. "Seems to me," he said evenly, "if you weren't taking packages that don't belong to you, you wouldn't have had that problem." The words lingered. Geraldine's face turned crimson, though whether from anger or embarrassment, no one could tell. She turned on her heel, retreating into her house as fast as she could, slamming the door behind her. The neighborhood was left with the stench, yes, but also with a new awareness. They had all suspected. Now they'd seen. Preston closed his door and leaned against it, his laughter finally spilling free. But beneath the humor, he felt something stronger. Relief. Weeks of doubt, whispers and dismissal were finally over. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't paranoid. She was guilty, and the truth had clawed its way into the open. Still, he knew Geraldine wouldn't go down quietly. People like her never did. The question wasn't whether she would fight back. It was how. But before Geraldine could even think about saving face, the neighborhood had already started whispering, and whispers had a way of turning into open rebellion. The smell lingered in the air for hours. Even long after Geraldine had slammed her door shut, the sharp sting of skunk spray drifted across the cul-de-sac, clinging to hedges, cars, and anyone unlucky enough to pass near her garage. Neighbors carried on with their evening routines, but the conversations all circled back to the same subject. Geraldine Caffrey had finally been caught. Preston sat on his porch, arms resting on the rail, listening to the chatter ripple across the block. Irene Callahan walked over with a glass of iced tea in hand, her nose wrinkled. "Well," she said, lowering her voice just enough to keep it between them. "I can't say I'm sorry she got sprayed," Preston smirked. "You saw it." "Everyone saw it," Irene replied. "She's been throwing her weight around here for years." That was the first time she looked like a regular person instead of a dictator with a clipboard. Across the street, Victor Rowe called out, loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear, "Hey, Preston, whatever you ordered sure made an impression." The neighbors nearby chuckled. A few clapped lightly, though they disguised it as casual gestures. But not everyone found it funny. The next morning, Geraldine emerged again, this time wearing rubber gloves and dragging bags of ruined clothes to the curb. Her SUV's trunk hung open, a box of half-used cleaning supplies inside. She scrubbed at the garage floor with industrial cleaner, her face pale, her eyes sunken from a night without sleep. Preston watched from his kitchen window. He expected her to ignore him, to pretend nothing had happened. Instead, she spotted him and shouted across the street. "You think you're clever, Mr. Mallory? You think you've won something?" Preston stepped outside, calm but firm. "I didn't put that package in your garage, Ms. Caffrey. You did. And you did it because you thought it was yours to take." Her hands trembled as she gripped the scrub brush. "You're going to regret this. I'll see to it." The threat hung in the air like the odor she couldn't scrub away. Preston didn't flinch. "You've been making everyone here regret moving in. Maybe it's time you regret something for once." The exchange didn't go unnoticed. A few neighbors poked their heads out, whispering to each other as Geraldine stomped back into her garage, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the siding. Later that week, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Unusual, considering Geraldine typically liked to control the agenda and maintain an air of calm authority. This time, the room buzzed with quiet outrage before the meeting even began. Residents filled the folding chairs, fanning themselves with the paper packets of bylaws Geraldine had printed. She entered last, her face composed, but her posture stiff. Even freshly washed, her clothes still carried a faint trace of the skunk's punishment. She cleared her throat. "Neighbors," she began, her voice crisp. "I've called this meeting to address an incident that occurred on my property. A dangerous animal was deliberately placed inside a package on Mr. Mallory's porch. This was an act of harassment, and I will not tolerate criminal behavior in this community." Murmurs rippled through the room. Preston waited, his palms flat on the table. When she finished, he spoke up. "With respect, Ms. Caffrey, I think the real issue is why you were taking a package that wasn't yours." Her head snapped toward him. "I was safeguarding it. That's my responsibility as HOA president." "Funny," Victor Rowe cut in from the back. "I don't remember electing you as the neighborhood mail clerk." Laughter broke out, thin but sharp, cutting through the tension. Geraldine's cheeks flushed. "This is no laughing matter." This was an attack. Irene raised her hand. "So you're saying you admit to taking the box?" "I was acting in good faith." "No," Preston interrupted. His voice was steady, louder now, carrying across the room. "You were acting in self-interest, and you've been doing it for years. Packages don't just vanish. They don't walk themselves into your garage." The murmurs grew into open agreement. One resident said, "I lost my gardening tools last spring." Another chimed in, "My daughter's birthday gift disappeared." One after another, voices stacked on top of each other, forming a chorus Geraldine couldn't drown out. She raised her hands, but her authority was slipping. For the first time, she looked less like a leader and more like someone cornered. "I will not stand here and be slandered," she barked. Preston leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "No one's slandering you. We're just telling the truth you've tried to bury." The room fell silent for a beat, the weight of his words settling. Geraldine tightened her grip on her clipboard, then dropped it onto the table. The crack echoed, sharp as a gavel. Without another word, she stormed out of the room. The residents sat stunned for a moment, then began whispering furiously. Some laughed, others shook their heads, but all of them knew Geraldine's grip on the neighborhood had been broken. But Preston also knew this wasn't over. People like Geraldine didn't surrender. They schemed, and he needed to be ready for what came next. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt different. The morning after the emergency meeting, Preston noticed little changes. People waved at him longer, conversations lingered at the mailboxes, and for once, residents weren't speaking in hushed tones. The fear Geraldine had cultivated with fines and threats seemed to be cracking. Still, Preston knew Geraldine wouldn't give up without a fight. Sure enough, within days, envelopes started appearing in mailboxes. Each one bore the HOA letterhead and Geraldine's signature at the bottom. Preston's contained a notice about lawn care violations, citing grass that was a quarter-inch too long. He read it twice, laughing bitterly. His yard was immaculate. That evening, Irina walked over, holding her own envelope. "Got one too," she said, shaking it like a bad lottery ticket. "She fined me for leaving my recycling bin visible for 3 hours. 3 hours Victor joined them, waving his own notice. Mine says my driveway has cracks. It's concrete." "Of course it has cracks." They looked at each other, the truth dawning. Geraldine was lashing out, trying to reassert control. Preston crossed his arms. "This isn't enforcement. It's retaliation. She's hoping we'll back down." Instead, the opposite happened. Within 48 hours, half the neighborhood gathered in Preston's driveway. People who'd barely spoken before were swapping stories, comparing fines, realizing they weren't isolated victims. A younger resident named Carmen Alvarez spoke up. "She fined me last month for my curtains. Said the color clashed with the community aesthetic. I paid it because I thought I was the only one. But if she's been doing this to all of us..." "She has," Preston cut in. "And she's counting on us staying quiet. That's how she keeps power. She divides us." The group nodded, murmurs of agreement building into determination. For the first time, they were united. Word spread fast. A petition circulated, calling for a vote of no confidence in Geraldine's leadership. Within days, more than half the residents signed. Some even offered to run for board positions themselves. Meanwhile, Geraldine doubled down. She sent out mass emails accusing Preston of orchestrating an attack on the integrity of the community. She claimed the Skunk incident was proof of his recklessness, but her words rang hollow. Too many people had seen her carrying the package, too many had felt the sting of her arbitrary fines. One afternoon, Preston found her standing on his sidewalk, clipboard in hand, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "You think you've embarrassed me, Mr. Mallory? You think the whole neighborhood will side with you?" Preston met her glare calmly. "They already have, because you forgot the one thing that keeps a community together. Trust, and you broke it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment he thought she might yell, but instead she turned and walked away, her shoes clicking sharply on the pavement. The following week, the HOA board convened for a special session. Residents packed the small meeting room, buzzing with energy. Geraldine sat at the head table, her posture stiff, her blouse pristine, but the faint smell of skunk still seemed to follow her like a ghost. One by one, residents spoke. Irene described her missing packages. Victor recounted the golf clubs. Carmen read her fine aloud, the absurdity of it drawing laughter. Every testimony chipped away at Geraldine's veneer of authority. Finally, Preston stood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't rant. He just told the truth. "I moved here looking for peace," he said. "Instead, I found someone abusing their position to control and take from the very people they're supposed to serve. That's not leadership. That's selfishness. And we deserve better." The room erupted in applause, louder than any sound the HOA had heard in years. When the vote came, it wasn't close. Geraldine was removed as HOA president. She sat stone-faced, refusing to meet anyone's eyes before storming out of the room without a word. For Preston, the moment was bittersweet. He hadn't moved to Plano looking for a fight. But in the end, Standing up to Geraldine had given the neighborhood something it hadn't had in years: a voice. That evening, as the sun dipped low, neighbors gathered in Preston's yard for an impromptu cookout. Victor brought ribs, Irene baked cookies, Carmen set out coolers of soda. Laughter filled the air, where once there had only been tension. Preston leaned against his porch railing, watching kids play tag on the grass, listening to the hum of conversation. For the first time since moving in, he felt like he truly belonged. But even in that joy, one thought lingered. What would happen if Geraldine tried to claw her way back? In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood felt like it had been reborn. The tension that had once hovered like a cloud was gone, replaced by the sound of lawn mowers humming, children playing in the cul-de-sac, and neighbors chatting without lowering their voices in fear of being overheard. Geraldine, stripped of her title, retreated into her house. Her roses still bloomed, her driveway still gleamed, but she was no longer the queen of the block. She had become just another resident, and in many ways an outsider in the very place she once controlled. Preston noticed the difference almost immediately. People waved with genuine smiles. They lingered by his porch, asking how he'd settled in, inviting him to join them for coffee or evening walks. What began as a battle over stolen packages had turned into something far bigger, a community rediscovering itself. One night, sitting on his porch with Irene and Victor, Preston admitted, "I didn't think it would end like this. Honestly, I thought she'd bury me in fines until I couldn't take it anymore." Irene sipped her tea and gave a small smile. "That's what she was counting on. But you didn't give in," Victor chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "She ruled with fear. All it took was one person to stand up to her, and suddenly everyone remembered they had voices too." Preston let the words sink in. He hadn't set out to be a leader, but sometimes leadership wasn't about titles or positions. It was about refusing to stay silent when silence was the easy option. Still, he knew the lesson wasn't just about Geraldine. It was about life. There will always be people who try to take more than their share, who hide behind authority or intimidation. And there will always be moments when staying quiet feels safer. But silence gives them power. Standing up, even when it's uncomfortable, shifts the balance. The skunk in the box had been a wild idea, almost reckless. Yet in that absurd moment of chaos, something important happened. Geraldine's mask slipped, her authority crumbled, and the community saw her for who she truly was. That exposure gave people the courage to speak, to share their own stories, to push back against years of intimidation. Preston didn't think of himself as a hero. He was just a man who wanted his packages. But in fighting for something small, he ended up sparking something much larger. Weeks later, the neighborhood elected a new HOA board. Carmen Alvarez, the woman whose curtains had once been deemed unacceptable, was voted in as president. She promised transparency, fairness, and open dialogue. The difference was immediate. Meetings no longer felt like lectures. Instead, they became real conversations. One Saturday afternoon, Preston received a delivery, a new grill he'd been saving up for. He set it up in his driveway, and before long, neighbors wandered over, drawn by the smell of burgers sizzling. Someone brought potato salad, another brought drinks, and before he knew it, the cookout stretched down the block. As laughter and music carried through the evening, Preston thought back to his first weeks in the neighborhood. How lonely, frustrating, and suffocating they had felt under Geraldine's watch. Now those same streets were alive, filled with connection. He leaned against the grill, flipping burgers, and smiled to himself. This was what community was supposed to be. Not rules and fines and fear, but people looking out for each other. The story of the skunk became neighborhood legend. Kids retold it with exaggerated details, how Geraldine screamed like a banshee, or how the smell lasted for a month. Adults laughed about it at gatherings, not out of cruelty, but as a reminder of what they'd overcome together. For Preston, the moral was clear. Sometimes the smallest act of defiance can break the strongest chains of control. And when one person speaks up, it gives others permission to do the same. So if you're listening to this story, Take it as more than just a funny tale about a skunk. Take it as a reminder. If you see someone abusing their power, don't let fear keep you silent. Stand up, even if your voice shakes. Stand up, even if it means risking comfort, because once the truth is out, it can't be taken back. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We've got more real-life stories that will make you think, make you laugh, and sometimes make you shake your head in disbelief. Don't miss what's next. Hit that subscribe button and be part of this growing community. Because in the end, every story, just like every neighborhood, belongs to the people brave enough to tell it.